a special affinity with our physical family, don't we? And so there's some partiality there. And that's why sometimes people resent this thing called nepotism, right? Nepotism. You know what nepotism is. That's where, okay, you're in a position of authority or power, and you hire every relative to take the positions below you. And so nepotism can be something that is a demonstration of a favoritism. And it's not always wrong. It's not always bad. For instance, a man starts a business and he grows that business. And then when he gets old, he turns it over to his son, who has worked with him all along, side by side, perhaps for many years. And so he turns it over to his son or his daughter, perhaps, and they continue that business. That's, that could be called nepotism, but it's also something that we do naturally, isn't it? Because of that partiality. So we have partiality that way. We have partiality concerning our countrymen, don't we? Don't we? When I go overseas, sometimes I'll meet another American, but I'll tell you the honest truth, I usually don't spend much time with them. I don't do it because I'm there to teach the native people. I'm there to teach the people who live there. But if you're just touring around, you want to be, or you might prefer to be with people who speak the same language, have the same cultural background, do those things. So those are forms of partiality. But we're talking about in this passage, partiality when it comes to people who are rich and people who are not as rich, who are poor. And desiring instead, or showing preference for those who are rich, because perhaps there is this attitude, well, maybe they can help me in some way. This poor person, they're lower than me, they're less than me, and so, they really couldn't do anything to help me in my situation. And so you have this passage where they tell the poor man to sit here at my footstool. Doesn't even get to sit on the footstool, but sit at the footstool. And that's pretty bad partiality. Well, in chapter 2, then, we get to where we're going to talk about verse 14 through verse 26, faith without works. Faith without works, or faith and works. And I like that description better, faith and works, because there is a relationship. They go hand in glove. You cannot have faith without having works when it comes to Christianity. And we'll see that as we look at this. This really is the application in verse 14 through verse 16 of being a doer of the word. Let's read verse 14 through verse 16, and then we'll make a couple of comments. What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? What profit is there? We know that faith is essential to our salvation, is it not? In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6, it is clearly stated, without faith, it is impossible to please him. It is impossible to please God without faith. So there's no way we can be saved without faith. We have to have that belief that there is a God, that the God of the Bible is the God that created, sustains, and providentially cares for all of his creation, including all of us, that he gives us every good and perfect gift, as we saw in chapter 1. And so we believe that there is a God. It is essential to have faith. Without it, you cannot please God. And God is a rewarder of those who, he goes on to say in chapter 11 and verse 6 of Hebrews, is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. So we have to diligently seek him. So here we have an application. There are works that God expects us to walk in. And here he is saying, can faith save him if you have no action Faith without works, it can't save you if you don't act upon that faith. And he uses this example of being a doer of the word in verse 15 and 16. If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? What does it profit? Any of you ever gotten to the point you had no clothes? You had no clothes? Or you had no food at all? None? In Asia and in India, Northeast India, where I've worked a long time, it's not uncommon for people to have 2 meals a day. They don't have 3. We're kind of used to having 3 meals a day, right? You get up in the morning, you have breakfast, you have lunch, you have dinner. And in Asia, it's not uncommon for people to only have 2. Why? They don't have the money for food, or they don't have enough. And so they only eat 2. And if there's some kind of a famine, some kind of a drought, anything like that, that cuts down the production, increases the price. It's not uncommon for them to cut back to 1. That's it. And so I've told people about Brother Joycing Inge one time. He came to the school and he shows me this big stainless steel bowl full of these black orbs that were about as big around as maybe a little bigger than a dollar coin. And I said, what is that? He said, they're spiders. It's a particular kind of spider that comes out at a certain time of the year, and they have a lot of them. And they capture them and they pull the legs off and they roast them and eat them. You know, how many of you have ever eaten a spider? Knowingly, that is. You know, I say that because I've eaten a few bugs here and there when I was running, you know, and you just kind of inhale the bug accidentally, you know. But I never knowingly or willingly ate any kind of a bug, right? So we don't do that. But in places like Asia, where there are 4 billion people and sometimes they are extremely poor, they eat just about anything that is edible. And that's different. So if we see somebody who's naked, destitute of daily food, and then he says, and you say to them, depart in peace and be warmed and filled, but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? So you give them very kind words, but you give them nothing of help. Does that help them at all? No. It doesn't help them at all. And I will admit, you know, it's really hard to know in this country sometimes what the situation is for people. You understand what I'm saying? Like I'm at the gas station getting gas, and the guy walks up to me and says, I need money to be able to get home. Lived, I think, over at Old National. He said, I need a couple of dollars to pay for gas. I said, well, where's your car? Why? Because, well, I'll go give him $5 worth of gas or something, you know, but I got to have a pump and I got to have a car. Oh, no, I don't have a car. I got to ask one of these people to give me a ride over there. You know, are we really sure he's trying to get home, or is he trying to get a little money so he can go and buy himself a bottle of wine or something? I don't know. It's very sad. But we don't want to be like that. We don't want to be jaundiced to the point that we don't help people. And so words are not of aid to these people. And it's important for us to remember that there are works that God expects us to be engaged in. There are works that God expects us to be engaged in. Look at Ephesians chapter 2 for just a moment. In Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 8 through verse 10. For by grace, verse 8, you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. Okay, so often the Calvinists will take this verse, verse 8, and they will expand that and say you're saved entirely by grace through faith, and that works have absolutely nothing to do with it. But if you look at it in the context, he goes on and says there are certain works that God has ordained that we are to walk in. The works that we are not saved by are works that men come up with. Okay? You go to a priest, and the priest tells you, well, if you want to be absolved of these sins, you have to do this or that or whatever. Right? Well, that's human determination, not God's determination, not God's teaching. And so we are not saved by the works that men come up with, but we are to engage in those works that God has ordained for us to walk in, to obey, to engage in. And so we are to do that. In fact, in Titus chapter 2 and verse 14, we are told that we are redeemed. God has created or redeemed a people, Christians, who are to be zealous of good works. That's what he says. We are to be zealous of good works. So there is a place for works in our lives. And by this activity, by these good works that God has ordained that we are to walk in and that we are to be engaged in, we are to lay up treasures, and we are laying up treasures in heaven. Remember, in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 19 through verse 21, we are told, lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust corrupt, where thieves break in and steal. Okay, we're not to lay up treasures on earth. But we are, he goes on to say, to lay up treasures in heaven where these things don't happen. Moth and rust do not corrupt. Thieves do not break in and steal. And then he says, he concludes by saying, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Where is your treasure? Where is your treasure? And you go over to 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 17 through verse 19. And I want you to read this with me. So go over there for just a moment. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 17 through verse 19, he gives some warnings, some teachings to those who are rich in this world. It's not against God's will or God's law that a man be rich. What is against God's law is when we allow those riches to become our God, to become the thing that consumes us and becomes our most important aspect in life. Because there have been some very wealthy people in this world who were very faithful to God, who did not allow their wealth to be that which basically designated or what defined them. Men like Job. Job, the richest man in all the East, lost everything, still was faithful to God. He went from being the most wealthy man to being the most physically deprived of any kind of physical well-being, and also lost his family and his wife. So he lost all of those things, and yet he still was faithful to God. What does that tell you? When he had his wealth was not what defined him. His faith is what defined him. And that's very critical for us to understand that. So it's not against God's law that a person be wealthy, but it is very few that are like Job. When they become wealthy, oftentimes the wealth begins to corrupt them. It becomes a problem. So in verse 17 to verse 19, 1 Timothy chapter 6, he says, command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty, nor to trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God who gives us richly all things to enjoy. Now listen, verse 18. Let them do good that they be rich in good works, ready to give, willing to share, storing up for themselves a good foundation for the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life. What are they doing? By their good works. Laying up for themselves a good foundation. Where's that laying up at? Where are they laying it up? In heaven. They're laying their treasures up in heaven. They're not laying them up here on this earth. They're laying up treasures in heaven. You have something you want to? No. Okay. Look like you want to say something. Okay. But anyway, all of these things are important, and for us to keep in mind. This passage created a terrible, that is in James chapter 2, created a terrible dilemma, and continues to this day to create somewhat of a dilemma for Martin Luther and for the Calvinists to this day, because they have a hard time reconciling the idea of faith involving works. Because they take passages like Romans chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, and you can go over there just to look at that for a second, and chapter 5 and verse 1. I can get over to it in just a second here. Hold on. Romans chapter 1, verse 16 and 17. Oh, going the wrong direction. No wonder I'm not finding it. Romans 1, verse 16 and 17. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. And then in chapter 5 of Romans, in verse 1, therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, so we're justified by faith. But here we have a passage that, as we see down in verse 24 and 25, indicates that we are justified by works. And so they saw these as sitting in juxtaposition to one another. They could not harmonize them. Luther couldn't harmonize them in his mind. And yet, if you look at the scriptures, and we're going to look, you will note that it explains this for us. Because he explains in the very next verse, in verse 17, and going through the end of the chapter, that faith without works is a dead faith. And in the last verse, he points out it's like this body without the spirit. If the body is without the spirit, what happens? Okay, yeah. But if the body is without the spirit, what is the body? It's dead. So the body without the spirit is basically what? It's nothing. It's just going to return to the dust, correct? So you've got to have both. And so he says faith without works is like a body without the spirit. There is action involved in living the Christian life. It's not just a belief in God. And so in verse 17 and following, he gives repeated evidence or emphasis to this fact of faith without works is dead. And so he says it not just here in verse 17, but he says it again in verse 20 and then again in verse 26. Faith without works is dead. So you have to have action here. And so he's saying really a dead faith is worthless. Faith has to be demonstrated in order to be effective. How can we, Matthew chapter 5, how can we be the light of the world and the salt of the earth if we don't actively engage in living the Christian life? Can we be effective? Can we be the light of the world? There has to be something we do. There has to be something we do. And so it's important for us to understand this. Faith must be demonstrated. But that's true of everything, isn't it? In your marriage, is it essential that love be demonstrated?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I expected that. If it's not demonstrated, what happens? Dissatisfaction, home life gets a little bit uncomfortable, right? You get burnt offerings and fiery sacrifices and that sort of thing, you know. And so you want to demonstrate love in your marriage. How about justice? Okay, you shouldn't have done that. But nothing is ever done. If nothing is ever done, is it of any value? You say you got a justice system all you want, but if there is nothing, there's no consequence, literally, you can tell people they're wrong all you want. But if you don't have some kind of a bite to it, what happens? The lawlessness just increases, right? There's got to be a little bit of punishment involved, or else it becomes a worthless justice system. And so I think that illustrates pretty much what we're talking about. You know, Peter, when Jesus came and walked on the sea in Matthew chapter 14, beginning in verse 22, Peter had to do what? He had to get out of the boat and start walking on the water, didn't he? He had to act in order to demonstrate his faith. And when he stopped for a moment and started looking around, what happened? He started sinking, right? He took his eyes off of the Lord, right? And so, but the point here is he had to do something. There was something engaged in. There was an activity that had to be done in order for him to follow in what Jesus wanted him to do. Now look at verse 18 and 19. Verse 17, 18, and 19. We'll read those quickly. Thus also faith, if it is by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. By my works, by my actions. And that gets back to what we were saying. Now verse 19. You believe that there is one God, you do well. Even the demons believe and tremble. Why do the demons believe? They know God.
They knew who he was.
They know God, right?
And it also shows when people say that all you have to do is believe. The devils believe and tremble, but we know they're not going to.
Right. They know their ultimate destiny, don't they? They know their destiny, and they tremble because they know they're going to be cast into the lake of fire. They know they're going to eternal destruction. Matthew 25:41. They know that, and they tremble. The sad reality is people need to know this as well. You know, you can go to Matthew chapter 7, right? In Matthew chapter 7, in verse 21 through verse 23, it points out very clearly that there are going to be those on the day of judgment who are going to say that they have done many things in the name of the Lord, but they really didn't do the works he said they were to do. They didn't do the things that he prescribed they were to walk in. And they need to know their eternal destiny. They need to be aware of where their destiny lies. I'm going to read that passage, chapter 7 in Matthew in verse 21 through 23. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, okay, they're recognizing the true God, just like the demons, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. So if I follow what some man says that I need to do in order to be saved, or do the works that men come up with, it's not enough. It's not right. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name? Cast out demons in your name and done many wonders in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practiced lawlessness. They want to have their own law. They want, and you know, there is a form of religion masquerading under the name of Christianity, and it can make you feel like, well, I'm doing a lot of good things. And they are doing a lot of good things oftentimes. They are doing a lot of good physical things. Over the last 100 years or so, there's been a real increase in the social gospel. You understand what I mean by that? Social gospel. I run into this overseas all the time. Can you build us a hospital? Can you build us some schools? Can you build us any one of those types of things? Roads, you know, bridges. I mean, you could go on and on. You know, you can make our life better and help us physically. Now, I'm not opposed to helping people physically. I mean, we are doing a lot of work with the people in Manipur who are undergoing tribal warfare right now and trying to help them with the work that I'm doing. But that's not our primary work. And our primary work is to try to bring people to Christ. Well, what's that? And I'm sorry.
There's an organization, International Disaster Emergency Service.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's what they do. They're out to help people with hurricanes and tornadoes and earthquakes
Okay.
and whatever,
Yeah.
through local churches in order to bring them to Christ.
Yeah. And that's, you know, but it becomes the overwhelming focus ends up being helping people in their physical condition and trying to help them out of that physical condition. And I'm not opposed to that. As I said, we're helping people right now in Manipur who are undergoing tribal warfare and are in refugee camps and things of that nature. And they're not getting the food and stuff they need. So we're trying to send in food and other things. We're having difficulties because the government is cut off a lot of avenues. But we're trying to do what we can because it opens doors for the gospel. But it can't become our sole purpose, or the primary focus cannot be the physical. It has to be the spiritual. And that has to be what it is. And so we use the material assistance to try to open doors for the spiritual message of Jesus. But, yeah.
What the world doesn't understand. God said, he said, at your best, you was just still the rags in my eyesight. Now, the world do a lot of good things. There were a lot of good things that's done by non-Christians.
Mm-hmm.
But what they need to understand, God don't see it the way they see it.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't obey the gospel of Jesus Christ, your good means absolutely nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And we as Christians, we live in a world that we experience things that what the world calls some good things.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to make a distinction.
Mm-hmm.
To be opposed distinction between the people that follow Christ and the people that have obeyed Christ and know the full meaning of that. The world doesn't get it.
Mm-hmm.
They do not get it. They don't view the thing the way that a Christian views.
Right,
They know the difference.
Yeah.
And we have to deal with it. We have to work with them.
Mm-hmm.
We stop with them. And that's why God told us to let our light shine.
Right.
That's,
Yeah.
that's
And we have to, we prefer one another. We prefer Christians. Uh-huh.
Social gospel.
Mm-hmm.
What are you talking about?
Well, what we're saying is this is what people expect when you go overseas. They expect you to build hospitals before you do anything else. They expect you to build schools before you do anything else. They expect you to help them in the physical realm before you do anything else. Yeah, that's a lot of it. And we are rich. We are very rich.
I mean, that's what the thinking is. Okay, you're American, you got money to build something.
Yeah, that's kind of the way they look at it. Yeah, they have a hard time differentiating between the spiritual and the physical. And sometimes we play into that because we help so much. And I'm not opposed to helping. As I said, I just sent a bunch of money over to buy goats for widows in India. Goats for widows. Okay. So we do that because widows are disdained in India. Once you're a widow, you got to understand, under Hinduism, historically, a widow, when her husband died, was to be put onto the funeral pyre and die with him. The British put an end to that. Okay. But they still consider widows to be bad luck. So families often have nothing to do with a daughter who is now a widow. It's sad. She's not allowed to come back. And Jim always told me about a movie called The Water Bucket, about a girl who was betrothed to an old man. She was like 14, 15 years old, married the old man, and just a few weeks later he died. She had no children, and the family didn't take her back. And nobody wants to marry her again because she's a widow. And so she's destined to be a widow for the rest of her life. No children, nothing. And so oftentimes those women end up in prostitution. And so we try to help them by giving them goats so that they can become business women, can raise mutton, can have milk and those types of things. We're trying to help them out of the poverty that they're almost expected to live in. And so we're not opposed to helping people socially, but it cannot become the central and sole focus of the work we do. So I always tell people my central purpose is to train men to preach within those cultures, within those countries, because I want men who are capable, well-trained, able to preach. And it cannot become that all we're going to do are these social things, because if we're not careful, it gets to the point that we'll be sending 90% of our money to help the people in need, because the people are always in need. They never stop being in need. Yeah. No, you can't. You can't. Yeah. You just preach it, lay it out there, and hope that they'll obey it. Yeah. Yeah. But you can't fail to train men to preach or to do the preaching because you're so busy doing the physical, social work. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, so if you don't get that, it's like not trying to see if this is how you are. Yeah, so either expect to give more of yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's, as Brother Nathan said, it's a worldly view. It's a view that is impacted by the physical condition that they're in. And I've seen people in very difficult physical conditions. You know, most people in other parts of the world, or a large percentage of people, still don't have indoor plumbing. You know that. Should I go and build indoor plumbing for people? Should I go do that? Now, if they don't have water easily accessible, I'm very willing to try to help them at least get a well. That I think is a good thing. And I can remember going to Central America one time, to Nicaragua. It does kind of scare you, doesn't it? Going to Nicaragua. And for some reason, I didn't have any translators. So I ended up spending a week digging ditches because we were working in a barrio and we were laying pipe for water. And I don't mind doing that sort of stuff, you know, but I was there. I had to do something. I wasn't, you know, I don't speak Spanish well. I can order something in a Spanish restaurant or something like that. But yeah. Yeah. Well, you have to be willing to do whatever. Yeah. Yeah. But we cannot, my point is we cannot be focused entirely on that, because if we do, we lose sight of our total, our overriding mission, which is to bring people to the knowledge of the truth. if we don't bring them to the knowledge of the truth, then we're going to be held accountable. We're going to be held accountable, yeah, for that. That's very important for us to understand. So anyway, let me get back. I'm sorry, Maylene, I got to get back because I only got a few more minutes and I want to try to finish this. But faith without works is dead. And he says that beginning in verse 20 again, 19 through beginning in verse 20, he says faith without works is dead. And then he uses Abraham. He points out Abraham. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with his works? And by works, faith was made perfect. Okay, faith is perfected by action. Okay, he says faith without works is dead. In other words, it doesn't bear any fruit, right? It's a dead faith. It doesn't bear any fruit whatsoever. And Abraham is an example of an active faith. In Romans, and we're not going to go there, chapter 4, verse 1 through verse 5, Paul talked about Abraham being saved by his faith. And so here you have his works being emphasized by James, whereas Paul emphasized his faith, his mental belief. How do you reconcile those two? Well, the easiest way to reconcile is just go over to Hebrews chapter 11. Go over to Hebrews chapter 11 for just a moment. And in Hebrews, you can see the clarification. In chapter 11, in verse 8, by faith obeyed when he was called to go out of the place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. And then you go down to verse 17, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son. Faith involves action. It's not just mental acceptance. It's not just belief, but it involves action. And Abraham demonstrated that. Abraham was justified, made right in the sight of God. That's what justification means. He was justified, made right in the sight of God by his active faith, by his working faith. Yes.
Don't you show your faith by works? It's works is showing faith.
Well, that's what he's talking about. Yeah.
And Abraham, God told him, he was supposed to offer his son Isaac
Right.
as a sacrifice.
Right.
So that's how he was showing his faith. It was showing that he trusted God.
In fact, if you read the rest of that passage in Hebrews chapter 11, beginning of verse 17, Abraham was fully aware that God had made the promise that this is your child of promise. This is your son of promise. This is your son, your only begotten son. This is the one through whom the promise is going to be fulfilled. How is God going to fulfill his promise if this child is dead? Abraham knew these things. And so he knew that God could raise him back up. He knew that God would raise him back up because this was the child of promise. He's told me to kill him? Okay. So as far as he was concerned, in Abraham's mind, if he had plunged that knife into him, God would have brought him back to life. There was no way he could fulfill the promise he made. Why? Because he had that deep of faith in God. He had an unquestioning faith in God. That God, even if I offer this son like you said, you have said that this is the son, the child of promise through whom all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. How can that be done? God, you always do what you say you're going to do. Since you always do what you say you're going to do, and this is what you've said about this boy, if I kill him because you told me to kill him, okay, I'll kill him because I know you're going to bring him back anyway. I'm convinced in Abraham's mind that's where he was. And he says that in Hebrews chapter 11. He tells us that.
Obey God no matter what.
Yeah, that's right. He obeyed God. So you want to understand what faith and works combine, and works make your faith perfect, complete, mature. Without it, you don't have the kind of faith that God wants you to have. Yes, Henrietta, and then I got to quit.
Blind faith. You can't question, well, every done faith, you can't say, well, I don't know. You have to go ahead and do it, and you have to, it's blind faith.
It's a faith that doesn't have, yeah, we don't question because we don't know everything God knows. We don't know everything God knows. Okay. Appreciate your comments and your questions, and we'll pick up. Well, no, we won't, because I think Alfred starts teaching next week.